story I like to tell is that about Switzerland. After the Swiss Federation was founded in 1848, I think, they decided that the federal government should be kept deliberately weak, just like the Australians did and like much of the Americans did. And so they decided that the federal government should not have a permanent home. So every year, Parliament met in a different city, which at some point became rather ridiculous and prohibitively expensive. So they opened up in the late 1880s competition for a new capital. And there were 3 cities in the running: the city of Zurich, the city of Basel, and an obscure canton called Bern. Guess who won? Of course, Bern did. And there were reasons for this. Well, Basel was too Catholic, so of course it couldn't have sort of a Catholic city as your capital. Zurich was too mercantile, and sort of merchants spoil public policy. You can't have a mercantile capital. Bern was suitably obscure to be capital. But given the Swiss system, both Zurich and Basel had to be compensated. Zurich with an Institute of Technology, and Basel, I believe, with courts and a law school. So, and similarly, when Enid talks about South Africa, I won't steal her story, but she has an interesting story to tell when it comes to financing. But cities really do want to be capitals, despite the costs of being capitals. And I think that at this point, I'll turn the presentation over to Enid to talk about structure and finance issues.
Thank you very much, Rupak. And thank you also to the President and the Dean for being here today and for hosting this event. We're really delighted. And thanks to Bob, who tirelessly put this together. Whatever time of the day I emailed him, day or night, he always got right back to me. Rupak's done all the really fun stuff. He's talked about the story of being a capital and why you want to be a capital and why they're located where they are, and then I've got to deal with this governance and finance part. But it is an interesting book. It is available at the back. I have my copy here. Each chapter tells a different story about a different capital city. In terms of governing structure, there are 3 types of governing structures. The federal district model, which is where through the Constitution or even not in the Constitution, the national government carves out a district to be the capital out of existing states or provinces. And it has certain powers. City-states are cities that have city powers and state powers. And then there are some capital cities that are just cities within a province or state. Now, when we put together the concluding chapter for this book, because that was really what Rupak and I had to do for this book, we did, of course, share it with our chapter authors. It was surprising to me to discuss to find out that the governing structure led to some controversy. So I had a long debate with the chapter author from Australia, because he said to me, Canberra is not a federal district, it's a city-state. Even people in Washington tell me we shouldn't have put it under federal district, we should have put it under city-state. So it's surprising what you think will be controversial. Rupak mentioned there are 26 federal countries. We've only looked at 11 here. That's not because these are better federal countries than the rest. It really has to do a lot with the availability of the authors and to do a manageable project. But this breakdown is not uncharacteristic of capital cities in federal countries. In other words, the majority of them are federal districts, fewer city-states, and there are a few that are cities within a province or state. So, federal districts are a particular kind of structure where the national seat of government is not under the jurisdiction of any one state or province. So Washington is carved out of Virginia and Maryland, but it is not part of either of those states. And in the book, we talk about, and Rupak talked a little bit about it, sort of the national objectives for a capital city versus the local objectives. These are cities where people live, go to work, use services like any other cities. And so at one hand, you want them to have some local autonomy to deal with local issues. On the other hand, the federal government has a keen interest in its capital city because it's representing the nation. So when you have a federal district, the federal government has a bit more control over its capital city than just a city that's in a province like Ottawa that really has very little federal control over it. But even within the federal district model, there are different degrees of control. So you have Abuja, for example, in Nigeria, where the federal government appoints the head of Abuja. This is not a directly elected mayor. And they have a lot of control over all of the decisions made by Abuja. At the other extreme, you have Canberra, which is also, I would call a federal district, although our author really wanted it as a city-state, is largely an autonomous city-state. The federal government does provide policing and does get involved in planning, and can theoretically overrule decisions, but doesn't generally do that. So Canberra is less controlled by the federal government than Abuja. As I mentioned, there are issues of local democratic and accountability and an accountability deficit when the federal government has a lot of control. There can be limited fiscal autonomy. But on the good side, and in the other models this is less true, there's direct access to federal funds, so that the federal district is very directly involved in a financial way in federal districts. In a city-state, you've got the city providing both city functions and state functions, as in Berlin and Brussels. The difference between them, one of the differences between them and federal district is they face no restrictions on the state functions. They can perform all the functions that other state governments are performing. There's less influence by the federal government in a city-state than in either of the other two models. Sometimes there's limited fiscal capacity because some of these city-states are very small. And again, there's limited access to federal money because they're treated like any other state in the country. They're not given any special distinction in terms of finances. In federal countries, of course, there are provincial or state governments that generally have control over local governments. So in Canada, for example, as in the US, local governments are not in the Constitution except as a responsibility of the provincial governments or the state governments. So the federal government has much less control over these capital cities than it would in a federal district or city-state model. There are other ways the federal government, of course, can influence any city in the country. Federal government has spending powers. They can spend their money anywhere they like, and so, of course, they can influence local decisions through their spending decisions. They can create national capital commissions, as they have in Ottawa, or the National Planning Commission that you have here in Washington. And the federal government owns land. So in Ottawa, for example, there's a greenland around the city of Ottawa that's federal-owned land that cannot be developed. There's limited institutional interaction with the federal government. In Switzerland, for example, the municipalities can't go talk to the federal government. They have to go through the cantons. It's the same in Canada. So there's informal mechanisms, but there's no formal ways to really talk to the federal government. So this really leans on the side of local autonomy, but then a lot of these cities complain they don't get enough money from the federal government, they don't get any recognition from the federal government's not interested in them. So those are the three models of governing structure. In terms of financing capital cities do the same things that all cities do. They provide police and fire protection, they collect and dispose of the garbage, they provide recreational and park facilities, they provide water, roads, transit, all the major local functions. Cities get their revenues from taxation. Here in the US, local governments levy property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes. In Canada, we're just restricted to property taxes. User fees for things like transit, recreation, intergovernmental transfers, investment income, and some other revenues. But there are exceptions for capital cities. For example, Delhi provides city functions and state functions with the exception of public security, policing, and land use planning in the federal district. Canberra provides local functions, but as I mentioned before, policing is provided by the Australian Federal Police. So there are some exceptions. The property tax is a special case. In some countries, the property tax is the major source of revenue for local governments. Australia, Canada, the US, it's a very important tax. South Africa. Where the property tax is a major tax, being a capital has some implications. The federal government owns a lot of property in capital cities. The parliament buildings, the national museums, the office buildings, these are all federal properties. In some countries, the national governments pay property taxes on their buildings. South Africa is a case in point. In some countries, the federal government makes payments in lieu of property taxes. Belgium is an example, and Canada. And I've looked at payments in lieu of property taxes in those countries that have them. And Canada has one of the most sophisticated systems in the world, where the federal government makes payments in lieu of property taxes that are intended to be comparable to what the property taxes would be, certainly on their office buildings in the city of Ottawa. They also make payments in lieu on prisons and hospitals and ports and other facilities. Those are more contentious, of course, because what is the market value of a prison? How do you actually assess the tax base? But it's not hard to do on a government office building that's right next door to a private sector office building. So we have a fairly sophisticated system of payments in lieu. They do in Belgium, but they don't do it at 100%. They do it at about 70% of what the taxes would be. But some countries do neither, as you well know. Australia makes no payments in lieu, no property taxes, Mexico and the US. In the US, the federal government makes payments in lieu of property taxes on forest lands, but not on any of its buildings, for example, here in Washington. And Nat will tell you when he does his presentation just how much foregone revenues that means. What about federal compensation to cities for being a capital? We talked about the allure of being a capital, but there are some costs associated with that in terms of beautifying the city, in terms of policing and security issues. In some countries, there are grants provided by the federal government for these specific services. And the countries, the cities are there, Berlin, Bern, and Brussels. Sometimes there are no federal grants for these things. The provincial government is the major funder of cities, and so there are no federal grants. Sewanee and Cape Town are interesting, and Rupak referred to it. They get no federal compensation for being the capital city. In fact, they don't ask for any money. They know there are costs, they don't ask for them, because they're afraid if they ask for money, they will have their capital city status removed. So they're obviously doing some calculation in their head that's saying there are greater benefits from being a capital than costs, so we're not going to ask for anything. There was only one study that's ever been done on the cost-benefit analysis, and it was done in Switzerland, and it was a little contentious because some people agreed on some of the costs and some people agreed on some of the benefits, but I think overall there is a net benefit. Some of the costs are directly assumed by the federal government, so it doesn't appear in the city budget, but as I said, Delhi does policing, does land use planning. In Ottawa, there are federal lands and parks and some roadways that are federal roads. In Washington, I understand court security is done by the federal government. So just some final observations. And the first is that we tried to slice and dice our case studies to come up with some general conclusions, and we were not able to do that. The financing arrangements were different, the extent and type of federal compensation was different, the governing structures were different. Some cities are planned, some are historical. We thought, well, do planned cities get more money than cities that are historical capitals? There were no patterns. Different models seem to have worked in different places at different times. Not a very satisfying conclusion, but it is the conclusion we reached. However, there are some issues in all of the capital cities. The first is the need to balance national interests with local interests. Again, people want services, they want a democratic government, at the same time that the national government wants the national interests met. There are issues around federal compensation, which I've already talked about. There's certainly in most cities a revenue shortage for for those cities that rely on property taxes, and Washington would be a case in point. We felt there's a need for elected councils to achieve local autonomy, and that wasn't, they didn't exist in all of our capital cities that we looked at. And of course, all cities need sufficient revenue-raising authority to meet their expenditure needs. So there are some policy choices. The first one is about the federal compensation. The second is about whether property taxes or payments in lieu on federal properties should be made. That's not a question. They should be. There's no reason why two offices next door to each other, pretty much the same market value, similar activities going on in each building, that one should be paying property taxes and one should not. That there's competitiveness issues, there's equity issues, they should be paying property taxes. One of the interesting issues in many of our capitals was that the geographic boundaries of the capital city do not coincide with the boundaries of the economic region. You know that in Washington. You've got people in Maryland and Virginia coming into the city, using services and not paying for them. It's difficult for a federal government to deal with capital city issues, with planning, with budgets, with service delivery, when the capital city is only a small part of the economic region. If we're talking about transportation and land use planning, these issues go across those boundaries. The final thing I want to say is that we became very interested in these issues around fragmentation in metropolitan areas. Issues about how to undertake regional land use planning in a place like Delhi, where there are 30, 40 local governments who are each doing their own planning, who are each elected to meet the needs of their constituents. How do you deal with the fact that services spill over into other municipalities, that the roads you have in your municipality are being used by people from other municipalities? How do you share the costs fairly in a region? Just because the road is here doesn't mean we should pay for all of it if other people are using it. How do we get these municipalities next door to cooperate on things like land use and transportation planning? You know, amalgamation is obviously an option, but not a very likely one. I can't see 30 governments amalgamating into one city. So we became very interested in this issue, and it came out of this Capital Cities project. So the forum's next project in this area is a new book that we're going to be working on the governance and finance of large metropolitan areas. And we're doing this in 10 federal countries, not looking at the capital cities, because they're often not the largest, but the major cities in each of these countries. So I'll stop there.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here at the UTC. I'm very happy that Dr. Sessoms invited us, Dean of the Business School, and Bob Ebel, who really worked very hard to put together this seminar. Bob has been a critical intellectual force for all of us in this particular area. I'm also very happy to note that some of my colleagues are here. Mahmoud, Norton Francis is over there, and delighted that Ava Joshi is there as well. And I'm perhaps the only speaker who can pronounce Rupak's name properly. That is Rupak Chattopadhyay. Got it right? Okay. Well, the paper that is in the book obviously carries me as the author, but those of us who are in Washington know the bureaucracy is that bulk of the work was done by my colleagues, among them Marcy Edwards, Yassim Elmez, Bob Gerardi, and of course Bob Ebel. But if you like it, it's me. Otherwise you can blame Bob Ebel. Before I start, I would like to tell a little story that I'm sure some of you may have heard about it. It's about a Trappist monk who was allowed to speak every 20 years. So first 20 years passed, and he said, food bad. Another 20 years passed, and he said, rooms cold. Another 20 years passed, and he said, I quit. And the prefect said, look, you have done nothing but complain ever since you arrived. Well, poor monk wasn't a complainer, but he just forgot some basic rules of communication. Know your audience, speak their language, you can retain your accent, but above all, make it interesting. Well, my problem this evening is I can follow all the rules, except I just do not know how to make busy finances interesting. In my life as an accountant, I have seen many complex and boring things. Busy finances takes the cake. With that warning, I'm going to talk about busy finances. I'm not going to go through my presentation, it is too late in the evening, but I'm going to hit some basic points. Most important element of my presentation is this chart that I'm sure you see. This is basically all you need to know about district's finances over the last 15 years. What you see there is in mid-90s, we had roughly $500 million deficits in our fund balance. Our bonds were rated junk bonds at that time. The vendors used to line up outside the offices of the then Chief Financial Officer, Tony William, to get paid, and threatening the city that, look, if you do not pay us now, we will discontinue services. At that time, Congress took over the city under the Constitution. The US Congress has responsibility for the District of Columbia. So they basically took over the control of the city, established a control board, and removed all the financial powers from the elected officials. Because by that time, the General Accounting Office, in those days used to be called GAO, basically declared the city near insolvency, and no capacity to pay its bonds indebtedness to meet basic essential services. Move forward roughly 10 years, in 2005, 2006, our fund balance, as you can see, is roughly $1.5 billion. Our bonds are rated AAA by rating agencies. By that time and today, as Bob pointed out, we have accomplished 13 consecutively balanced budget with surplus. The 14th, the year 2010, which we are currently closing, I guarantee you it will be a balanced budget. And 2011, the year that is about to begin on October 1st, will also be a balanced budget. And today, we are welcome presence on Wall Street. Indeed, our bond offerings are getting awards from the municipal bond associations. So how do we explain this transformation from near insolvency to financial viability and financial prosperity? Obviously, the establishment of the control board was the key. But the control board was basically a voluntary association, I should say, of 5 individuals with very little staff, and they were vested with the responsibility of roughly $500 billion of budget on a local level, and about $10 billion on a gross basis. So within the control board, they established an office of an independent chief financial officer. The primary function of that office is to assure the Congress, citizens of the District of Columbia, that city would remain always financially viable, meaning it will have access